everyone. Welcome to Wellness Wednesdays with Stephanie. I am your host, Stephanie Buckland, and I am delighted and super excited to be interviewing one of my soul sisters today. Her name is Hanna Uí Ghabhain, and she has so much to offer the world. I'm so totally elated about this conversation. Thanks for joining me, Hanna.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. I'm so happy to be here with you and all of your listeners as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's super exciting. I think this is going to be a super interesting conversation. So I hope you all stay tuned. So Hanna, can you give our audience an introduction of who you are, what you're up to in the world, and what kind of magic is showing up as a result?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. So, usually, how I summarize what I do is I say I am a storyteller, and that storyteller title takes many forms. Mostly, what I do now is help people through therapy, through tarot, and through expressive writing to be able to tell their story through the lens of narrative. And I'm sure we'll get into what exactly that means. My career predominantly has been in news journalism. I've been a news journalist for the past 10 years, and I transitioned into more mental health writing in the past several years. And that led me to return to school. And I'm currently in a Master of Counseling program, getting my license as a licensed professional counselor to provide therapy to people. So in that, a lot of my theoretical orientations are centered around storytelling. So Gestalt, Jungian psychology, those types of practices, ACT, things like that, that really help people who have gone through a childhood trauma to be able to restory their lives. And saying that we can't always change what happened in our stories, but we can develop our narrative. So that's what I'm transitioning into. On that side of my work, on the storytelling side, I do expressive writing workshops. I write books. I help other people write their books. And so, really, my life is saturated in storytelling. I'm a folklorist. I'm a member of the American Folklore Society. And my folklore, to describe that, what is a folklorist? I pretty much usually describe it as I collect rumors and legends. And so my focus is on Celtic and Norse rumors and legends and mythology, and that's kind of my specialization. I've studied tarot for several years, using that storytelling Jungian lens. I've studied world religions and different esoteric methodologies and principles of thought and philosophy to kind of help people do guided introspection through tarot. So we know that everything we have inside of ourselves is available. Everything that we need is already available to us inside of ourselves. And tarot is one way to help you tap into that inner knowingness, because it uses that universal language that I'm sure we'll also talk about as well, not to give away everything right off the bat. But that's what I'm passionate about, is helping people to tap into that inner knowledge. I'm mostly a shadow worker in that sense. I find that when people are aligned with me, when they come to me, usually it's at that time where they're needing to do shadow work and we engage deeply in that story. I do a lot of work around grief and trauma, and helping people kind of restory those parts of their lives. And it's such an honor. It's been the greatest honor of my life to be able to hold the stories of people as a journalist, as a writer, as a ghostwriter. Now transitioning to therapy as well, that truly has been the greatest honor of my life. So I'm excited to share with everyone here today as well.
Yeah, it's very deep. There's a lot there. That's amazing. You've had quite a career.
It's been a journey. It definitely has been a
Yes.
journey.
So what do you think, before I get into the why, like what do you think led you to leave journalism and go into therapy?
Um, I haven't quite left journalism. I've left the news capacity. I
Right.
still am a journalist, but I guess I've kind of transitioned the way it looks. So I was a strict news reporter. I worked for newspapers. I loved it. It was such a fulfilling career. I've won 20 different awards for my journalistic work, specifically investigative journalism and journalism within the courts. And so loved that time. During that time, I told the stories of people sometimes at the best moments of their lives, but due to the beats that I covered, often it was the worst points of their life. And I would see Mr. Rogers has a quote. And he said that when he was a child, his mother would tell him when something bad would happen or there would be a tragedy to look for the helpers. And
Mm.
so I was so seated in these moments of deep trauma for people in my news work, especially being in the courts in an area of the country that has very high substance use disorders and just very deep, deep trauma. So I was bearing witness to trauma every single day. And I recalled Mr. Rogers telling that story and hearing it on one of his shows when I was a kid. I was like, I need to look for the helpers. And so as I began looking for the helpers in this, I met just beautiful, wonderful people who brought healing into these very traumatic situations. And I met a victim's advocate during doing that work, and I wrote her story. And I was so fascinated by her. And there was a psychologist as well who I spent a lot of time with. And I was thinking, I think I would really enjoy doing that, because also I could see when I would tell these people stories and give them a chance to tell their story with dignity and respect, which news stations don't always afford people. But when I would sit with them and I would give them the chance to tell their story, I could see this measurable shift in how they approached the trauma. And I had people come to me. There was one woman who her daughter had been murdered by her husband, and horrible, just tragic situation. And I covered this story for a couple of years. And her family, I did some stories with them talking about domestic violence and about her experiences. And after, I was trying not to cry. It was one of the most beautiful moments of my life and career. The mother came to me after and said, we weren't afforded that type of respect throughout this process of just being able to tell our daughter's story and have her be seen as a person, not as a victim. She was a person. And so that was kind of around when that happened, that case.
Aha moment.
Yeah, that was kind of my aha moment. I'm like, this is what I'm going to shift. And so that's why I shifted into mental health writing. So now I write for different magazines, more on a freelance basis, doing more mental health based stories. And I also help people write their memoirs. And usually those memoirs are, telling stories of trauma healing. So yeah, so I'm a writer and still do that, but just kind of transitioned. In my journalistic work, I still do investigative pieces, kind of looking at the intersection of folklore and mental health, and synthesizing all of that together in more of those research oriented pieces, more academic. So,
Yeah. Wow. So, okay, then what do you think led you to journalism in the first place?
oh, let's see. When I was about 7, 8 years old, I was the founder of the Daily News.
Oh,
And
wow.
I would make this little newspaper and I called it the Daily News. And it basically cataloged what was happening today. This is what we're having for dinner tonight. And I would give it out to to my family.
That's
Storytelling is innate
adorable.
to who I am. It's innate to human nature.
Oh,
All of
yeah.
us, storytelling it's part of what makes us human. Look at cave drawings. I mean, one of the things that defines us as human is our ability to interact through storytelling. And that's how our brains learn. We learn through the story process. And so um, stories were very important to me for many reasons. I loved truth. I loved the act of, and specifically for journalism, that truth seeking was really important to me. Um, and I love a good story. I love fairy tales. I loved Disney as a kid. Fantasy, that's still my favorite genre. I love fantasy,
Me
because
too.
it speaks to us
Uh-huh.
in a way that we could read all the self-help books in the world, and there's nothing wrong with self-help books. But when you're reading, like, I don't know if anyone, it's a really popular book series, so I feel like people in your audience may relate. Sarah J. Maas, Court of Thorns and Roses, any of her series, it's this fantasy world with fae and and dragons and all these fantastical creatures, but she talks about real trauma, real emotions, real human experiences. And so when I read this story and I read Feyre and what she's been through, and Nesta and her trauma, even though they're like these powerful fae who live in a fantastical world that I am not in, I relate to them on such a deep level. And that's the power of storytelling. So,
Mhm.
um, when I was a child, storytelling was my safe place. Books were my safe place. And when I read about Susan Pevensey or Samwise Gamgee, or especially Katniss Everdeen, when that series came out, I was obsessed
Mhm.
because Katniss, Susan Pevensey, Samwise Gamgee, they told a story that I couldn't yet tell myself. I couldn't articulate the trauma that I was going through, but they spoke to that part of me that needed a voice, that wasn't safe to have a voice at the time. But through those stories, I was able to find safety and I was able to feel not so alone, even if it was through this fictional character. And that gave me hope to be able to persist through. And I have four younger siblings. And when I'm the second oldest, when I moved out of the house, one thing I gave them was a love for stories. And I would always read to them. And that was a big deal to me, was giving them these stories and having them engaged in that world. And years later, this was just last year actually, so about, well, 12 years after the fact, my little sister told me, she was like, one of my favorite memories from my childhood was when you would read us stories. She was like,
Aw.
I always remember you reading us the Chronicles of Narnia. And she's like, and after you moved out, I continued doing that because she said it gave her that, that inner strength as well. And that, like, it's like, that's the power of stories. And it
Yeah,
really
you're gonna make me
changed.
cry.
I wasn't planning to cry. I'm a crier though.
Me too.
Um, sorry.
It's
Um,
okay. Take a
but
moment for me.
that was when she said that, I'm like, oh, like that's the power of stories. And it touches us across time, it connects us across time, it heals. And so that's why I'm so passionate about what I do, because those four babies, like I wish I could have given them so much more in life, but I gave them stories and they were able to carry that with them. And that was a gift that, helped my sister become who she is today. And she's an incredible person. And so, yes, that's the power of storytelling. And
That is
that's why
awesome.
I do what I do.
Yeah. So you mentioned storytelling for healing and the concepts of like releasing our shadows and understanding our inner landscape and everything. Like I think it is really beautiful the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. I mean, I would love to connect our listeners to how can storytelling be healing other than, the connecting the time and space. That is definitely, I can
Mhm,
relate to that because I remember stories that my dad told me, and my
mhm,
dad's not on the planet anymore,
mhm.
but I still have his stories,
Yes,
so it's a beautiful thing.
yes.
So how do you think, as you're moving into professional counseling, how do you think
Mhm.
storytelling is going to help you in that profession?
Yes. Um, when you're in a therapy session with someone, it's all about the story. You're telling your story, you're listening, you have someone listening to your story, and you're engaging in it in such an intimate way. And so for me, transitioning into therapy was it was quite a smooth transition because I'm used to telling people stories and listening to people's stories and asking them questions to help them tell their story with authenticity. And so therapy, that's what you do as a
Yeah.
therapist, just in a different form. So that's why I say I'm a storyteller, whether therapy or literally writing a story, it's quite similar.
Oh.
So how storytelling becomes healing is that I the orientation I usually think of it from is Gestalt. And in Gestalt, we think about parts of a whole and how all parts of us are included in our one core self. And so our core self, our true authentic self, exists in all of us. Sometimes we've met that, sometimes we lose it, sometimes we regain it. Other times we've never met our core self. For me, I never met my core self until I was in my 20s.
Mhm.
Our true authentic self. We have the other versions of self that come around us, and this is where we get into Jungian psychology of the archetypes. And we have these different characters and versions of self that exist. And so in my own therapy was the process of here's the imposter and what's her voice sound like? How did she come to be? This imposter syndrome voice, that's not my core voice.
Right.
Imposter syndrome voice is not me. It's a part of me. How did she come about? What's her origin story? And let's find her origin story. And then there was a part of me that was empty and a shell and very corpse-like. What's her story? Where did she come from? What's her origin? And so as you begin to meet these different parts of self, you integrate them into your core self and you see yourself in this full story. So that's one aspect of how storytelling is very powerful because it leads us to be able to articulate different parts of ourself, to hear their voice, to recognize their voice. So now when I hear the imposter, I'm like, oh, that's not my core self. This is the imposter speaking. I know her voice. I've met her. I know her story. I know where she came from. um, and it helps us to sort through the narratives that are not our own. So one thing my therapist always likes to say to me, she goes, whose voice is that? And what she means by that is um, these
Which part of you is
narratives.
speaking?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Which part of you is speaking right now, right?
Well, and not even, yes, that and is it my mom's voice? Is it my dad's voice? Is it society's voice? You know, whose voice is that as well? Because some of these patterns and these narratives that we develop are not our own. They're ones that are taught to us, that society teaches to us, that our family structure teaches to us. And we internalize them as self-narratives when they're not actually authentic to our core selves. They're relevant, they're real, they affect us. How do we integrate them? And that's where the narrative piece comes in. What's my narrative around that? I was told this. Um, you know, you may have grown up in a system that told you your body was shameful. And that is the story that you were told. That's the pattern of thought that may have been integrated into your pattern of thought. But when we can look at our story and we can see, oh, the story is that I was taught this in this way, this became a pattern. And when we can tell that story and visualize that story and kind of see the storyboard, then it loses its power because we can name it. And we know from the Key of Solomon that names hold power. And when we hold something's name, we hold the power. When we hold our own name and can speak our own name, we hold that power and we know the core self and can call our core self by name. That also is power. And that's where storytelling becomes healing. One of the many ways. But
Yeah.
that's the kind of the interpersonal and the internal healing aspect. That's creating the story of your life and developing narrative. That's how it becomes healing. And it's a
That's
process.
amazing. Yeah, I could actually use this myself because I have some stories that I'm still trying to work through in my past. Um,
We all have it.
we
Every
do.
single person on this planet can
Yeah.
benefit from
That's,
this.
I
Yeah.
think, part of the example of being in Earth School. We are here to learn, and sometimes
Yes.
learning is very painful.
Yes. Yes. It's not easy. People see growth. Oh, it's Instagram, yoga, journaling. It's like, sure, sometimes it's also sobbing on your carpet, screaming into your
Yeah.
pillow, processing, and that's the shadow work, processing these very real, raw human moments. That's also healing. And often it gets worse before it gets better. And that's part of the process too of, sometimes it's really hard to acknowledge those parts of our stories or to see people in our stories as inauthentic lights and realize exactly who they were, not who we wanted them to be, not who we needed them to be, but who they
Mm.
were.
Yeah.
That's tough.
Oh,
But
yeah.
but where it gets you, the freedom it gets you, if if you're willing to do that, it's worth it. And some people aren't willing, some people aren't ready. And we have to give ourselves consent on this process of if you are not ready for something, that's okay. And healing's not forced. Shadow work isn't forced. Give yourself consent in this process because you don't want to traumatize yourself in the process of shadow work. It's meant to help
Yeah.
us process trauma. So That's where it's helpful to have someone who can guide you through, because it is very deep work, a therapist, to have friends around you who can help support you and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I found, because I love therapy. I have been in therapy since age 15, and
Therapy.
it's just been something, yeah, it's just been something I've always sought out. Anytime I don't have a therapist, I'm
Mm,
looking for one because they always help.
mm,
And yet I don't know that I've ever really talked to a therapist about shadow work and made that connection. So I'm going to have to
mm,
ask my therapist if he knows anything about it. Um, but I think it is something that's really powerful in our healing process and acknowledging our shadows,
mm,
seeing them for what they are. And like I've written before that demons aren't really demons. Your inner demons are usually your past traumas. So it's not like this big hairy monster you're going to face when you go inside. It's you're going to
yes.
see your inner self, probably a younger version of you, that is crying and screaming and miserable. And I've actually done this shadow work, so I know this feeling. I remember sitting with my 16-year-old self.
Mm,
Now, when I was 16, I don't know about you, but high school actually really sucked for me. I was emotional. I was suicidal. I had all this stuff in my body and all this pain. And I didn't really know how to deal with my emotions. I was an empath, and I had everybody else's
wow.
emotion. That it was way too much for me in my tiny little 16-year-old body. And so I was
Yes.
angry. I was a very angry 16-year-old. And that anger has carried with me
Mm,
until recently. I started to acknowledge the former versions of myself,
mhm,
one of which was in 2016. One of them was when I was in my 20s, about 27, 28. One
mhm,
of them was when I was 16. One of them was all the way back to when I was 3 years old.
mm.
So
Wow.
shadow work has been powerful for me to help
Yes.
me process that stuff and clear it so that I'm not living from that place. Because I think that's the underlying truth about the shadow is that when you don't acknowledge it, if you don't do anything about it, you actually make choices from that place.
Hmm.
And those choices could be
Yeah.
toxic. They could create more suffering for you. They could create more trauma
Mhm.
because you're, choosing from the trauma to choose more trauma. It's like, okay, universe, give
Yes.
me more of that.
Yes. No,
So,
thank you for sharing that, because yes, that is so much of the process, is going back and meeting those parts of self. And
yeah,
so often we want to forget about those parts of self or make them
stuff
be
it down, right?
irrelevant, or
Right.
we continue to try to animate them, like Frankenstein them, rather than letting them rest and memorializing them. And there's that process of honoring them. And this is Persephone, of course, named after the
Aw,
goddess of
hi,
death and
Persephone.
spring. She always comes for conversations like this. She's my little familiar, and
Yeah.
she gravitates whenever I have these conversations with people.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
we've had some tears, so she's addressing your
Yes,
energy
she's very
too.
responsive to this type of energy. But
Aw.
um yes, no, that's so much of the process, is going back and meeting those parts of self and honoring them and memorializing them. And it's and to integrate them into self. And I know I've gone through that process as well, of going back and meeting those different versions. And you mentioned the anger as well. And so often people want to shy away from the anger.
Oh, especially
Um,
women. Yeah.
yes,
It's
that
like
it's not appropriate.
it's not appropriate. Yes, women are not supposed to be angry or frustrated. We're not supposed to express these emotions. And when we do,
Right.
we tend to get talked down to because we're expressing emotion that's not supposed to be ours. I always thought that was BS.
Yeah.
Like,
There's a
why
song
am
that
I
I
not
found
allowed to be
recently.
human?
Yeah, well, there's a song. I love music therapy and use music for therapy a lot for myself, and send songs to others. But there's a song that I found recently, and if you don't allow cussing on this, just bleep it out. But it's called All American Bitch by Olivia
Olivia
Rodrigo.
Rodrigo. Yes, I just heard it
Highly recommend
yesterday. It's
listening to
so
that. It
good.
it shows how it shows that suppressed rage, and
Yep.
that's part of the power of storytelling, because there's so much research. If you look up Dr. James Pennebaker, look into his research, um, he's one of the leaders in the world. I got the honor of meeting him, and he's one of the leading researchers and psychologists in the world who talks about narrative therapy and the power of expressive writing. And his research, he shows how, what the things that we suppress become pathological,
Yep,
and they can literally make our body sick.
exactly.
High
Yeah.
cortisol levels, they ruin our gut health. It took me years and years to be able to get my health the way it is. Like, you look at pictures of me from when I was, a decade ago when I was 20, I look younger now. I look healthier. Like, you can tell the marked difference that just doing therapy and doing the work of healing has done in my body, because I regulate my cortisol levels. I don't have gut problems anymore. And so much of that was just toxic stress related and holding so much pain and so much grief and so much anger. And that's, our bodies can't hold that. We
Exactly.
can't.
We
It
need
will.
to transmute it.
Yes, it becomes, my aunt told me one time when I was kind of making some radical decisions to really change my life and to process my trauma and do what I needed to do. She told me, she said, it's a slow death. She said, it is a slow death if you don't choose to heal yourself in this way, because that toxic stress, that trauma, those toxic abusive relationships, they become a slow death, and they do kill us, literally, not figuratively. Like, they affect our
Literally.
bodies in a
Yeah.
way that it literally can kill us. And there's
Yep.
plethora of studies to prove that as well, of,
And
especially with women, autoimmune disorders. And that's where
yes.
storytelling, articulating what is going on in safe spaces to live within our truth and our honesty. And that brings me to the story of On Morrigan. And I'm wearing a long sleeve, otherwise I would show you my tattoo of her on my arm, or her symbol, the crow. Um, but On Morrigan is a goddess in Celtic mythology, and she is the beacon of fate. And she's a chthonic goddess. She's a goddess of death, which means she's also a goddess of birth and of rebirth. She helps govern our fates. She asks us to look at our fates. She is a symbol of Seder, of weaving the fates, of weaving our lives, of telling our narrative. And Sarah J. Maas, to bring her up again, one of my favorite authors, she uses a lot of Celtic mythology and other mythological pantheons in her writing, and she has the Morrigan in one of her books. And again, the power of fantasy, of these storytelling worlds. In her book, I thought she had a really interesting interpretation of the Morrigan, because her Morrigan, she says her gift is truth. And she always says, I am the Morrigan, my gift is truth. And I thought, what an incredible and interesting way to interpret her power of the fates, by saying she is the goddess of truth. Because, and also in The House of Usher, which is a wonderful TV show by Mike Flanagan, one of my favorite directors of all time. If you haven't seen his shows, buckle in, prepare yourself. It's a ride, but they're beautifully done. His most recent was The House of Usher, and he also had a depiction of, he didn't say she was representing the Morrigan, but I perceived her as the Morrigan. And in this, she determines the person's fate, but she gives them a choice. And they have a choice in that, a choice in their truth and how they will live their truth. And she always gives them the opportunity to engage with the truth before their fate is sealed. And so,
Interesting.
to me, why the Morrigan, why I have her tattooed on my arm, and why she is kind of the Celtic goddess whose lore I embody the most, is because so much of storytelling and the process of healing is acknowledging the gift of truth.
Yes.
And in my childhood, truth was not acceptable. And
Mhm.
so when I came into the world with the gift of truth, with my throat chakra wide open, that was very suppressed. And it was forcibly suppressed. And because of that gift of truth. But when I stepped into it and took that on and really embodied that Morrigan energy of truth, very difficult, freeing. And they say, the truth will set you free. But it's true, when we can step into that truth and we can embody that Morrigan gift of truth, and engage with our fate and engage with our story and engage with our narrative, it's so powerful and life-changing, not just for ourselves, but it's life-changing in deep time, extending to the past, the intergenerational healing of the trauma of our family line. We're healing into the past, our ancestors and the traumas and the patterns, and then we're healing into the future, like my sister, my baby sister, and I can't talk about her without crying. So anytime I mention her, I'm gonna cry. Sorry. Sister, if you're watching this, thanks a lot. But then we extend the healing forward. And so I see her and I see, the way that in acknowledging the truth, the way that I busted through that concrete ceiling and then she just would soared, and that's what we do. When we engage in our story, we heal deep time in both directions. So it's really cosmic quantum work that we're doing here. It's exciting and it's powerful, and we're working on this quantum level, extending with our ancestors and those who will come after us. It's powerful work that I think we so often underestimate. And
Yes.
we'll go into therapy and be like, oh, we're going to talk about our stories. But it's like, we are doing this deep level quantum work. Like, this is sacred work. And it's an honor to engage in this work with one another. And so when you do this work, treat it as sacred. Like, you are healing generations before you. You are healing generations in front of you. Like, that is so amazing. You're
Yeah.
doing this work. And so treat it as sacred and honor yourself in that, and honor those parts of yourself, the imposter, the angry 16-year-old, the 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Like, Stephanie, honor those parts that they, and what they have done and the healing that they've created. And that's the work of storytelling and narrative.
Yep. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So you mentioned that you love expressive writing and that you're a writer. So I totally resonate with that. I have been a writer since honestly childhood. I love to
Mm,
write. I wrote poetry when I was a teenager, and then it switched to short stories as a young adult. And now I'm working on novels and
mm,
self-help
yay.
books and all kinds of things.
I love it.
And it seems like a lot of my storytelling has switched to video. I'm doing a lot of online video things instead of doing
Yes.
the handheld pen to paper or keyboard, if you will. Um, my stories tend to be very fantasy when it's fiction, but
I gotta read them.
I love, yes, I will absolutely. Once they get published, I will definitely give one to you because my first novel is about a gnome who wants to save the underworld, which is where all of the fairies and the magical creatures live.
Oh, I love
So it's a cool
it.
story. It's I think a 3 volume set. It's not just one book. I think it's like a long story. So
Amazing.
when I get to that, but I've
Oh,
actually I like to draw too, so I've actually drawn some of the characters from the book
oh, I
just
love
to
that. I'm
give
very
me
visual, so I love
inspiration.
when books have pictures in them.
So how do you use expressive writing in therapy? Is that something that you've used personally, or is it something you want to use when you get into counseling?
Yes, so both, all of it. So currently I do expressive writing workshops.
Okay.
And then once I get my license, I will elevate that to doing more narrative therapy. And that is something that you have a license for. So as a journalist, as a writer, who's been doing this professionally as an occupation for the past 10 years, I can teach on that level with that level of experience. And then I'm elevating to be able to offer narrative therapy.
Beautiful.
So as far as my um personal journey with expressive writing, I do that in therapy with my therapist, and she is so wonderful. So wonderful. And she really adapted her techniques to, meet me in the space that I was in, of I'm very storytelling, very music, like that's how I see the world. And so we do a lot of writing exercises. She'll ask me to tell things in a story format. Like when we were doing the gestalt of identifying the different parts of self, I drew them, really visualized. I would come up with like interactions of them talking to each other. And that's kind of a Gestalt two-chair method. If you do Gestalt therapy, you'll see that a lot of you actually have an empty chair and you're switching back and forth of, okay, I'm talking to my younger self. I'm talking to the empty self, like whatever, whoever you're speaking to at the moment. And then you
Yeah,
switch into their voice.
that's
Really interesting.
fascinating.
So that's
Yeah.
what I'm being certified to do, licensed to do. And it's what I've done in my own personal therapy. And for me, it was the most effective form of therapy. For people with CPTSD, that's complex PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, um, usually that type of somatic work. Talk therapy, studies have shown is not always the most effective for people with PTSD or CPTSD because that type of trauma lives in our bodies. People often hear, the body keeps the score. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote that book, and my grandmother's hands, there has been a plethora of research on that about how trauma is stored in the body. And so in my mind, when I worked with other therapists who were just purely talk therapy, I could talk through it. I could rationalize, my cognition with it was there, but yet I would have PTSD episodes and
It would still be
reactions.
in you,
It
right?
was still in me, and something would trigger me and I would have a PTSD attack,
Mhm.
And so my therapist now, Angel, um, wonderful person. She got me, did the somatic work through Gestalt therapy, through the two-chair method, through dissecting where those feelings were in my body. And that's really the only thing that has been incredibly effective in treating my CPTSD. And the studies show that that's very common for people with complex trauma, especially childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. The ACE scale, which is a 10-point scale that kind of evaluates the childhood trauma you went through. So for people with higher ACEs like myself, usually that's the type of therapy you need to do.
Hmm.
Um, so I have engaged in a lot of that. What was birthed from it was I love hearing about your novel because I'm doing something, a fantasy novel as well. And I wrote it coming out of a very difficult time a couple years ago, where I finally kind of had to go no contact with some family members. And that's a type of grief that is not often talked about. Grieving someone who's living and grieving them, losing someone to trauma, um, is a very unique experience. And so I was, I had a couple of very difficult weeks following that, kind of processing my new reality, of being in that space. And then one morning I woke up and I said, I have a story to tell. And I wrote a fantasy novel it was like 1,000 pages. I like them thick. And so, um, this big book, and I wrote it in about 5 months.
Wow.
Um, and it just all came pouring out. And at the time, I didn't quite realize what I was doing. But for me, writing is a channeling experience. And
Yeah.
so, even when I would, write for the newspapers, telling a human interest story, or when I'm doing memoirs for other people, I really drop into this channeling space, um, where I channel the story, mine or someone else's. And that's kind of how this book came to be. And it's an archetypal Jungian type of story where every single character can represent a part of one human psyche. And so all of them kind of represent different parts of my psyche. So there's the woman who is, very powerful and she's enraged. And there's the person who feels just absolutely defeated. And there's the one who's been trying and trying and beating on the door and trying to get through and fails over and over again. And, there are just all these different aspects of self, that from that point, the therapy that came after, especially the Gestalt therapy, helped me to realize, oh, Suri is this part of me, and Valala is this part of me, and Esme is this part, and was able to kind of see what I was doing. And so, um, expressive writing therapy can look a lot of different ways. It can be journaling about the experience. And Dr. Pennebaker, that's kind of what he studies, is writing about our experiences as they were. It can also be writing in poetry. It can be, like you doing the videos. It can be video. It can be art. Storytelling can manifest in a lot of different ways. There was a man I interviewed, and he does photography as his medium of storytelling. And he talks about his trauma through his photography. So many ways that can manifest. You don't have to be a writer to do it. You can have, what you perceive to be zero level of skill. It's the emotional perception of it. So right away, or take photo, do pictures, do art, whatever is going to resonate with you to tell your story. That's expressive writing. It's getting that expression out into a form that is visual and helps us to understand the storyline.
Yes, definitely. Let me see. So I journal. I have a separate book that I use as a gratitude journal because I felt like it needed to be separate for some reason. Um, and a lot of my journal writing, it's like I'm processing. Um, and I'll talk through things with my partner, and it seems her reflection has been that when I talk through something, I go in circles until I come to a conclusion.
Mhm.
And I think that I write in that same way. I go in
Mhm.
circles, I do another circle and do another circle until I start to see the truth in that pattern. And then
Yes.
I'm like, oh, now I get it. So
Yes.
it's almost like that is my process. And I
Yeah.
think I do that in therapy too, which
Mhm.
I don't think I ever really made that connection until someone reflected it back to me. So
Yes.
it's kind of cool to have a partner who can see that truth. Uh,
Yes. Absolutely.
you mentioned universal language. So tell me a little bit
Oh.
about your experience with that.
Oh, okay. Yes, I would love to. So Jungian psychology, Carl Jung, he was a psychologist who really was just revolutionary for his time. He was birthed out of, and this, we have to study history to know where we are. And his history was that he studied with Freud. Um, Freud, founded this modern field. Psychology, therapy, the practice of healing in this way has been existent since humans were alive. Freud was not the founder of this field. But anyway, I digress. He studied under Freud, but he really revolutionized the way that we conceptualize psychology, and he brought in the esoteric with
Mhm.
it. So universal mind is one of his topics that he's most known for. It's quite controversial in the psychology community because he conceptualized that we all are connected through these common universal symbols and archetypes, and
Mhm.
that we all contribute to that universal mind. So that's why in Celtic culture, we have the Morrigan. In Greek culture, we have Hecate. And in Egyptian culture, we have Isis. And
Mhm.
they all are the triple goddess. They all have very similar motifs of their mythology. And they all are in, at the time, what were completely separate cultures.
Mhm.
How did that happen? Hmm.
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 Must be one of our truths then, right?
Yeah, so Jung postulated that we have that universal mind. Um, and that these archetypes exist in just in the human experience. So that's why when, you know, like I'll use the example of Sam Gamgee from Lord of the Rings, like I mentioned earlier. So many people can relate to him in different ways, but that's because his character is an archetype that embodies specific traits or experiences. Katniss Everdeen, for another example, I identified with her so deeply, as did thousands of other people around the world when that book came out and then the movie as well. And that's because, we're all different people, have our own unique experiences. Katniss is a fake person in a fake scenario, but yet we all can identify with her because of the archetypes that she embodied.
Mhm.
So that's kind of universal mind, the universal connection. And so um in a therapeutic setting, in expressive writing, in folklore, why the archetypes are so important is because they tell us truths of the human nature. So when we read mythology, Greek, Celtic, whatever culture you may be in, and I always encourage people to look, what resonates with their DNA. Um, when you look into these different pantheons of mythology around the world, and we see these truths embodied through the mythology and the lessons that we can learn. And in ancient cultures, that's how we pass down knowledge. Those truths were told through stories. And a few years ago, I went up to Alaska for the summer, and I was experiencing a lot of grief, and I kind of carried that grief to Alaska because I'm like, where's a place that's big enough to hold my pain? And I was like, oh, Alaska. The Arctic Circle, which is one of in my astrocartography, Alaska is a very important place for me. And so I went to Alaska and I stayed in a little cabin all by myself and was there for a few weeks. And my brother lives up there. And so he was close by, but I kind of just like also invested in some time just myself. And while I was up there, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, they had recently done this incredible symposium where the university, they brought in elders of local Alaska Native tribes to teach their indigenous ways of education. And so from that, they produced this incredible guidebook it's meant for other universities to use to kind of adapt the program for their university. So I got the guidebook, got my hands on it and devoured it. And a lot of it was talking about how they integrated storytelling into their education. And so they were talking, one of the elders who gave his wisdom in the book, he was talking about how in so many indigenous cultures, like that's how knowledge was passed down. And, you wouldn't give advice, you would give a story because the story allows people to engage within their truth, where you could come to me with a problem, and we could talk through it and we could talk about, in a very matter of fact way, and I could tell you my opinion or my advice,
Mhm.
sure. Or I could give you a story and then you could interpret it through your perception, which is what matters in the scenario. And then it can bring out a truth for you in your light, and it can help you connect deeper with your truth, not my truth, your truth.
Right.
Um, and so in my culture, Celtic culture, it was very much the same way, storytelling, the stories of the gods and the goddesses and this pantheon filled with human emotion. And, our gods, they were, very human and they had rage and they aged. And that's what made them beloved, was because they were like us and they weren't some omnipotent, everything. And we could relate to them in that way. So that's really the power of those archetypes and that universal mind, and why we find that in so many different cultures, because it's human.
It's human.
It's expressions of the human mind.
Yep. I share a post every Friday, and I have a group, not a group, but an album that is called Oneness Consciousness.
Mhm.
This is on Facebook. So every Friday I post Happy Friday. Here's your inspiration for the week. And it's basically memes and pieces of inspiration that I've found on Facebook or Instagram that just express this concept of we're all connected energetically, emotionally. We have this
Mhm.
inner knowing of this universal connection, and it is part of my truth. I'm
Mhm.
a psychic medium, and the way that I connect to everybody in the world is through that universal oneness.
Yes.
So I perceive it as truth. It's, in psychology it might be a theory, but personally,
You've
I
experienced it.
yeah. Um, so let me see. My goodness, we have covered so many different things today. We didn't talk very much about tarot though.
Oh, and
So
this
talk a little
this
bit about tarot.
yeah, and our conversation just now kind of lends well to that. So yes, I practice tarot. Divination is part of my practice and has been part of my life since I was a child. And it's that inner knowingness, that connection to the universal oneness. Um, And these days, a lot of times people call it synchronicity, and it's being talked about. There are a lot of different, universities and research institutes that are starting to research these experiences of coincidence.
Nice.
It's called meaningful coincidence, and is kind of what the modern language is calling it now. But it's part of what it means to be human, to have these experiences. And most people, there was a study that showed that the majority of people have an experience with synchronicity or meaningful coincidence. Maybe we don't attribute it to that,
Mhm.
but it's that sense of knowingness. So tarot, I started reading a handful of years ago as a means to channel that inner knowingness.
Mhm.
And I use the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, um, with the symbology designed by Pamela Colman Smith, incredible artist. And I use this because, as my primary deck, because it really taps into a lot of the universal symbology. It uses a lot of Kabbalistic numerology. It uses color symbology, and it uses a lot of archetypal symbology. So because of that, I find that it's very useful for me to connect with that universal oneness through the archetypes. So when I do a reading for people, I always tell them that the knowledge that you're going to learn from this session is not me pulling something mystical out of the ether. It's literally your energy, and you have the answer inside of yourself. You just need to know how to tap into it. And sometimes when we're facing a problem, our vision, that's the nature of trauma, or facing whether, it's stress, that's something small that's still significant, or a massive trauma. Like it's all
Right.
meaningful and it's all important. And whenever we're put into one of those situations, our vision goes, and we have this little tube that we're looking through, and it can be really hard to get out of that box. And
Mhm.
so tarot, I describe it as a way to help get your mind out of the box, because you're thinking about the situation in different ways, and you're being asked to create connections with the symbology. So
Okay.
I will draw cards and lay them out for people, and um, say what the symbology means, how it connects their question. And then I always ask them to kind of elaborate on how, um, what interpretations they may give as well, or especially the imagery. So if I draw this card, I'll have them look at the imagery and kind of tell me what it means to them. I also often recommend using the tarot symbology for imagery work, like for meditation.
Mhm.
Um, and so to me, that's the power of tarot, is it allows you to expand your mind. And that's why I call it guided introspection when I do my sessions. Because it's guiding you through that process of tapping into your inner knowingness. And sometimes for people, that's the first time they've ever acknowledged that inner wisdom. And so it becomes a practice. I have found myself in Demeter energy a lot through my life, of that mothering energy, working with young Persephone women, helping them kind of step into their healing work. And I've been so honored to do that. And so a lot of young women, I've helped them get connected to a tarot practice, because especially for people, and again, most of my work is in trauma and CPTSD. And so usually the people who usually the people who find me are in that space of having CPTSD or something like that, and having trauma work to heal. And so I connect a lot of people with a tarot practice, because it helps us to trust ourselves again and to trust that inner knowingness. Because its nature is that it disconnects us from ourselves. And so the act of healing trauma is to reconnect with self. And so a lot of people find that tarot helps them to trust themselves again, and to be able to, especially if they've gone through abuse, parental abuse, or a partner, someone who they deeply, deeply trusted and who was supposed to love them. And that type of betrayal um, really goes very deep. And so for me, it's helped me. That's how I got started in tarot, was healing work. Um, and now I, help other people get connected with their practice as well. And drawing a card every day, it becomes a really great way just to kind of take a moment for yourself to tap into your inner wisdom, and to listen to that voice inside.
Absolutely. Beautiful. I love it. Okay, well, is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Oh, I can't think of anything else. This has been so wonderful. Thank you for holding this space to
I
have these types
know.
of conversations.
It's so important. I see it as my service to the world to
Mhm,
really connect people to healing because we're all seeking
mhm,
a form of healing. We want to get out of our own way. We want to heal the trauma. We want to heal the imposter syndrome. We want to heal
mhm.
all the crap, even the ancestral trauma. Like we're ready. I think collectively we're ready. And
Yes.
so a lot of people are really seeking. And so that's my service. It's like
Mhm.
that's just share all the different ways that we can heal so
Yeah.
that we can plant the seeds so that people understand a little bit more that maybe
Mhm.
they didn't have before. So this is beautiful.
Yes,
Um,
thank you.
okay, then any final thoughts, inspiration, anything you'd like to share to inspire the audience?
I would say trust your truth, lean into your truth, honor your truth, invest in your story, and honor that inner knowingness that will guide you to that story. Honor your parts of self. Don't be afraid of them. Honor the wisdom that the shadow holds. Don't be afraid of it. It holds a lot of wisdom for you. And if you can access that wisdom, you will learn so much about self. Live with gratitude. Um, when you heal yourself, you heal the generations before you, you heal the generations after you, and you are not alone. You are not alone in this. And there are communities out here who are open and welcoming to you, and all trauma can be healed. Um, this is the work of being human. This is the human experience, and we're in it together. So thank you for inviting
Beautiful,
me to share this, inviting to share my
beautiful.
story. It means a lot to be able to share my story in this space and to be able to help people hopefully begin a journey to connecting with their stories. And thank you for sharing your story with me as well. It's an
Absolutely,
honor. It's always an honor to hear people's stories. So thank
absolutely.
you for sharing this space as well.
You got it. One last thing. How can people reach you, Hannah?
So I have an Instagram. I actually just recently got started on TikTok.
Woo, me too.
So it's fun. I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok. I have a website that has a lot of my writing, and a blog. Through that, you can connect with me if anyone is interested in doing a tarot session, a guided introspection session. I do offer those. I offer distance Reiki as well, coupled with the tarot. So if anyone is interested in that, they can email me, and all the information is on my website. But my email itself is hsmithwriting@gmail.com.
Perfect. Excellent. And what's your website?
Good question. What is my website? Hannah Wordsmith at something.com. I don't know. It'll be in the comments.
That's totally fine. Yeah, it'll be in the description and we'll
Yes.
share it on the podcast channel as well. So
Thank you.
thank you, Hannah. This was just so much fun.
Thank you. This has
Yay.
been wonderful. I appreciate you.